Welcome into the second to last edition of the CFF Sites preseason preview series, where today we look at the Sun Belt Conference. The CFF Site, we've got you covered from preseason fantasy draft guide to in-season player rankings and projections to in-season DFS write-ups. The CFF Site's got you covered for all things college fantasy football. And if you haven't come in yet, now is the time. 4th of July weekend is here. Fantasy drafts about to heat up in the college fantasy football world. My name is Joe DeSalvo. I am joined by my partner, as always, Mike. Mike, here we are, second to last conference. We're almost done. 4th of July weekend coming up. We're going to get Sun Belt Conference knocked out. And then when we come back from the holiday weekend, we're going to take care of the SEC. And then from there, some odds and ends stuff. You and I are competing in some other drafts that will be going on throughout the summer. But, from this point on, it's going to be cleaning things up, maybe making some adjustments here or there. Some news that we hear on players, we may make some adjustments as we have just recently. But once when camp fires up, man, there's going to be a lot of toggling players, rankings, and never a better time to join the CFF Site, because you're going to get access to all of that movement. It's not static. We're going to keep you posted all the way through.
Yep, absolutely. Now to your part of the country in the Sun Belt here.
Yeah, we just finished our West Coast swing, man. So let's get into the Sun Belt, because we've got some new additions this year, right? I mean, we've got Southern Miss in, we've got James Madison, we've got Old Dominion joining the mix, Marshall as well. So the Sun Belt expanding. This probably won't be as short of a show as it was last year, because there's some other programs to touch on. So let's jump right on in it, Mike, where there's some changes just over in the state of Georgia, where Clay Helton takes over as head coach. He brings in Brian Ellis, who was the Western Kentucky co-offensive coordinator, right, in his last stop. That lineup, that roster was built. It was a different look. It was a run-heavy Georgia Southern roster. It's going to be interesting to see how they transition into the new era here. They've got Jeremy Singleton. They added him from the Houston transfer. They bring in Kyle Van Treese, transfer in from Buffalo. But, looking at the roster, I don't know if it's ready yet. Maybe Helton gets a mulligan this year to get that roster recalibrated moving forward. Not seeing much fantasy value here. Probably more of a wait and see for me. How about yourself?
Yeah, I think, he brought in a lot of pieces over the offseason, whether it be the portal and who knows? I mean, maybe there's some unearthed gems there at the wide receiver core that just didn't have the opportunity, right? Because they only, they were 14th in the nation in rushing attempts per game, over the last 3 years. So that's going to significantly jump here with Clay Helton as head coach and Brian Ellis, the new OC. I think around 33 passing attempts per game that you're looking at with Brian Ellis. It's about the personnel. Does he have it? Like Kyle Van Treese, was he ever fantasy relevant at Buffalo? No. Is he going to be with more passing attempts? Maybe, but he never impressed me. Wide receivers is interesting. I mean, Jeremy Singleton's, he was fine at Houston. He is our projected wide receiver 1 for now, but they had some guys step up in the spring game, like a Derwin Burgess, Caleb Hood. I know those two are pretty, small and quick there. So maybe they have some fantasy relevancy at times, but I think, down the road, this is going to be an offensive system maybe that we invest in this year. I think probably just look towards the waivers and see what transpires.
Yeah, and I'm curious if it's something's going to be very similar over at Louisiana Monroe, where Matt Kubik comes in as offensive coordinator, taking over. Rich Rods was there last year. You mentioned in the conference write-ups and some of our biggest questions in the preseason, he had some success with at ULM before with a former quarterback, Caleb Evans, during that 2017 to 19 stretch. Chandler Rogers, we have pegged in that quarterback 1 spot. As of right now, he's kind of where, if someone's going, a player off of this roster is going, he might be more of the flyer you're taking at the end of the draft, maybe just from upside. But is there anywhere else we're looking right now on this roster, or is this more of a wait and see as well?
Probably wait and see for me. But I might take some shots at the end of drafts, especially in deeper drafts, because I touched on it in the guide. Chandler Rogers, is a dual threat quarterback, and now offensive coordinator Matt Kubik, who was with the team previously from a few years in the past, had Caleb Evans, and that was a popular name for CFF players in the past. He had 3 straight top 25 fantasy seasons. And similar quarterback in the sense that they're both dual threats. Now, the big difference, I think, is Chandler Rogers is probably 25 pounds lighter than Caleb Evans was. But we saw just last year that Chandler Rogers can handle, 100 plus carries in the running game. So I'll be curious to see if maybe his weight changes on the listed school roster, whether that's accurate or not. But yeah, he's a guy that I want to take shots on late. And then I thought an interesting development from the spring was a guy that kind of popped late last year, Malik Jackson, at running back, where he had, I think, 2 100-yard games in the last 3 weeks, 20 plus carries in each of the last 3 games. He was kind of floating between running back and wide receiver during the spring, and now he's back on the roster as a running back. So that's a guy that I might kind of look at just because he kind of popped late last year, and he's shown that he can handle a 20 plus carry a game workload, even at his size at 175 pounds.
Yep. Well, let's go out west to Texas State, where you kind of feel like the wick's getting a little short for head coach Jake Spavital, but he did make a number of moves in the transfer portal, right? He brought in Lane Kiffin. I'm sorry, he brought in Lane Hatcher. Maybe he did bring in Lane Kiffin to help him recruit, because he did bring a lot of guys through the portal. He brings in Lane Hatcher from Arkansas State. He brings in DeMarcus Gregory from South Florida, who I believe at one time was at Ole Miss. Brings in Lincoln Pear from Arkansas State as well. You've got Marcel Barbie, the wideout on the roster, who's totaled 15 touchdown catches over the last couple of years. You feel like it's got potential. You wonder if you could put it all together, wondering if Lane Hatcher really is going to kind of have a quarterback one job all to himself this year. That's still up for debate as well. For me right now, Marcel Barbie, if anybody's going to take a stab at a Texas State player, it may be him, just because he's shown that he can do it over the last couple of years in this offense, which it shouldn't change much. But your thoughts on Texas State moving forward, going into the preseason?
Yeah, I think it's interesting just because, they haven't been good, right? But they did double their win total last year. But just, I know I say this a lot, the tea leaves, it's like you got a new athletic director, so he's got a new eyes on Spavs. And then I think he's got like he's got 4 coaches that left this offseason, and he's got like multiple coaches as offensive coordinators. I believe it's him really calling the shots on offense, but I don't know. It's just it seems trending downwards to me. Lane Hatcher's fine at quarterback. I chest out there for those that or I projected that Logan Bonner was the better quarterback of the two, and he goes on to an all-conference season where Lane Hatcher now downgrades to Texas State. So, he's whatever at quarterback. I'm not too interested in him. Running back, I know this was kind of a conversation with us during the offseason between Calvin Hill and Jamil Jeter at running back. And I found it interesting that it was Hill that kind of popped late in the year. He had back-to-back 100-yard games to close the season, but it was Jeter that had all the rushing touchdowns. And it's interesting that Hill got 12% of the red zone carries versus 23% for Jeter. So I think we would have more interest in Calvin Hill this year if maybe those are flipped, where he gets 20+% carries in the red zone. So I would like to see if that kind of occurs, because typically we don't have a running back in this system that's fantasy relevant.
Yeah.
And then the receivers. I mean, you touched on it. Barbie and Javen Banks are kind of the top two guys there, but nobody had more than 18% target share for Texas State. So interest, but very late in your drafts.
Yep, I agree. And that's why I just mentioned Barbie there. And it's sort of, let's see how it unfolds, and maybe we get some sort of waiver wire pickup as the season progresses. Now, let's head over back to Louisiana Lafayette, where, change in head coach, right? Michael Decimo takes over as head coach. Mike, you've had running backs leave there. First of all, quarterback Levi Lewis is gone, where he seemed like he was there for like 7-8 years, right? Montrell Johnson transfers out, the freshman last year, and follows Napier over to Florida. Amani Bailey transfers out, goes to TCU. We're assuming Chris Smith is going to take on a much heavier load this year. We mentioned maybe in, a lot of talk, maybe in another show, Jacob Kabadi, was moved over back to running back this year in the spring. They've got a couple of 3-star recruits coming in. For me in drafts right now, it's kind of looking at Chris Smith right now, assuming because of his proven ability, that he's going to get more of a heavier workload. We're not sure if it's still going to be a committee approach there, right? Because, some of the staff is still intact. But for me right now, all eyes are on Chris Smith, and it's sort of, you're taking a chance with him, rolling the dice and hoping you're going to get one of those Louisiana Lafayette running backs with a high, basically carry percentage. But other than that, I really don't have any interest in UL right now.
No, not a quarterback. Receivers, I like to look at target share. Nobody had more than 17% target share the last 2 years. Michael Jefferson, Peter LeBlanc, these guys are kind of big play threats. So, but nobody's going to get consistent work in the passing game. Like you mentioned, it's all about the running backs here for us, and it's interesting because Chris Smith, I don't know, he didn't live up to the hype last year. And now, is that due in part to him? Because Amani Bailey and Montrell Johnson, I think, showed out when they got carries last year. But this new head coach, comes from the Billy Napier tree. So even if Chris Smith is kind of the head and shoulders, clear cut running back one, is that kind of his coaching philosophy, that he wants to give a guy 250 carries. So I know you were high on Jacob Kabadi last year. Maybe you're just a year too early on that one, and maybe he becomes a viable running back 2 option here.
Well, the reason why I like the upside with Chris Smith, and I think he's worth the gamble in a lot of drafts this year, Mike, is just, you look at the second and third. Chris Smith led the team in rushing last year. He had 150 carries, 856 yards, 8 touchdowns. Montrell Johnson leaves for Florida. He had 162 carries, 12 touchdowns. Imani Bailey had over 100 carries and 8 touchdowns. The question is there any proven depth coming back, right? And if they can't develop that, then you can see a higher carry. They may have no choice but to use Chris Smith a little bit more in this offense. And you're talking about 3 running backs last year that all had over 100 carries. That was 415 carries amongst 3 guys. If there's nothing behind Chris Smith, there is a possibility we could see a 200 carry year from him if he stays healthy and nothing else develops. And that's the reason why I think he's worth the risk where we have him ranked, and why the reason, quite frankly, why he is ranked where he is right now, around that 30 spot.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see. You mentioned proven commodities. They don't have those, but they're always top third of the Sun Belt under Napier in terms of recruiting. So, they got turnover in the running back room. They got turnover on the offensive line. So I guess we'll find out how well Napier recruited.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's get into a new program, James Madison now. New program here. There's a lot to like about James Madison. Let's start with the transfers in, right? They bring in Todd Centeio, who I was not a big fan of over at Colorado State. I might as well beat you to the punch on that one. But I do like him over here, playing with James Madison. They've got Chris Thornton back, 1,000-yard receiver, one of their top wideouts left for South Carolina. They had Kobe White come in to form a BC receiver, but he left the program as well. Good sign, maybe, if you want to take a flyer on a guy like Reggie Brown late in your drafts as well. Mike Shanahan, offensive coordinator And I do think, and you know, Todd Centeio is a guy that I have taken in a couple of best ball drafts that we've done, late flyers. You're looking at an offense where Cole Johnson, the quarterback last year, totaled 47 touchdowns. I know Todd Centeio isn't Cole Johnson, but it is a system that has proven that it can produce, you know, a good fantasy quarterback. And so I do think there's definitely some value here in some of the James Madison players. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I like Centeio as maybe a last option on your roster.
Yeah.
You know, Cole Johnson, in terms of fantasy points per game last year, he would have been top 10 in the country if that were at the FBS level. But I know his 31 attempts per game last year was really an outlier in terms of this system under Mike Shanahan, because this is more of a run heavy based system on a year-to-year basis. So maybe there's some interest in Obasay, the running back one here. I think Chris Thornton is the one that I wish I had more shares of. You know, they lose Antoine Wells to South Carolina, who had 100 targets last year, and Kobe White, the Boston College transfer, reneged his commitment, I guess, and decided to enter the portal again. So there's no real clear-cut wide receiver two here. And really, if you look back, I have a stat here. Over the last 8 seasons, and this is it's consistent. It's not just, you know, last year with Wells and Thornton. Over the last 8 years, 57% of the receiving production goes to the top 2 guys on average in this system. So they typically make up for most of the production. Will that vary from time to time? Yes. We talk about systems. They're not going to, you know, remain the same year in and year out every single year. But typically the top 2 guys get fed in this system. So I do want to see if Reggie Brown, as you mentioned, they had a transfer from Monmouth, Terrence Green, I believe, had 1,900 receiving yards in 3 years. So I think if I'm watching for something this summer and in the fall camp, it's going to be Reggie Brown, Terrence Green. If somebody emerges there, I might have some interest in them.
I agree. I right now, for me, Reggie Brown is pegged as one of my deep sleepers right now going into the new year, just for the reasons that you mentioned there. Now, let's go over to Old Dominion, Mike, where, you know, there's some production coming back. You got Blake Watson back at running back, 200 carry season, 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns last year. Ali Jennings, the third top receiver. He was a 1,000-yard receiver for them last year. Zach Kuntz coming back. He caught 73 passes at the tight end spot. All 3 of those guys come back. They made a late run in the year. I think they may have won 5 or 6 straight to become bowl eligible. So we know that there's some fantasy appeal in this roster. Does it kind of start and stop with those 3 guys, though? Because right now there's nobody else off of that roster being taken. But look, when you consider the programs we just went over, that's 3 pretty decent players right now that are at least going in the first half of most drafts that you and I and probably everyone else is doing right now.
Yeah, I think the big question for me with the for the ODU guys is, do they have more upside than they posted last year? And I think that is kind of dependent, at least for Zach Kuntz and Ali Jennings, on the quarterback play.
Absolutely.
Which is kind of one of our questions that we discussed in the guide. And, you know, just looking at some early depth charts, it looks like Hayden Wolf is projected by most to be the starter. We're going with a projection here of Brendan Clark, the former Notre Dame transfer, to be the guy. I think he's still in the mix right now, but if you look back with Ricky Ron during his time at Penn State, his offense has flourished most with a dual threat quarterback, and that's what Clark can bring to the table. Wolf, I think, negative rushing yards last year, and I mean, maybe I'm biased after watching that bowl game against Tulsa, but he was garbage, right? They were just stuck in the mud for 3/4 of that game. So I think the Clark brings a little different element to the table. So that's kind of where our projection of him resulting in QB1. And, you know, being a 4-star kind of recruit, formerly of Notre Dame, hopefully he can bring something different to the table to elevate Kuntz and Jennings and even Blake Watson.
So let's go down to South Alabama, where they lose Jake Bentley. While Jake Bentley may not have been a world beater, he at least brought some stability to the quarterback position last year at South Alabama. This year, we're looking at Carter Bradley, the Toledo transfer, against Desmond Trotta, competing for that starting job. They lose Jalen Tolbert at receiver, a 1,400-yard receiver. He caught 82 passes last year. We've got Jalen Wayne pegged in that top spot. He caught 53 passes last year. Colin Lacey is still there. It's a major Applewhite offense. There's still a lot to like. It's interesting, though, we're not as high on one of the receivers, you know, on a receiver like Wayne this year as we were last year on Jalen Tolbert. Why do you think that is, Mike?
I mean, he was productive, right? He had 53 receptions on 80 targets. I think it's definitely noticeable his yards per catch average. He's not as explosive as Tolbert was. Only 12.3 yards per catch last year. So, I mean, he's going as a top 40 receiver. I have, you know, relative confidence that he can finish as that. I think as of now, he's kind of the clear-cut guy. But I would keep an eye on some of those secondary options. You know, I like Colin Lacey from last year, right? Yep. And you know, he produced at a relatively decent clip, very low, I think single-digit yards per catch. So he really didn't produce a ton, but he caught 40-some passes. So, you know, he's a guy I'll keep an eye out on. Alan Daly transferred from Kentucky last year. I don't remember what happened behind the scenes, but he was kind of off the roster for times. But he apparently had a really big spring. So if Wayne is not capable of ascending to that true wide receiver 1 role, I would potentially keep an eye on Alan Daly there. And, you know, another stat that's kind of interesting with Major Applewhite in his system, his wide receiver 2s have the 7th highest target share average over the last 4 seasons. So not only is, you know, his top guy getting targeted, but his wide receiver 2s are typically productive as well. So maybe that's Lacey, maybe that's Alan Daly. Remains to be seen, but you know, that's kind of what I'm looking for from South Alabama.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now let's go over to Georgia State, where, you know, they returned Darren Granger at quarterback. He had 20+ touchdowns passing and rushing last year. Kind of took over after, you know, Cornelius Brown, you know, was pegged as the starter. Really, Georgia State, that whole offense last year, Mike, was just completely got rebuilt. You've got a 2-headed monster back at running back between Jameis Williams and Tucker Gregg. Both of those guys went over 150 yards last year. Both of those guys scored 9 touchdowns. I mentioned to you early in the spring, I do like the Georgia State backfield. I mean, the passing game at receiver, it's just sort of a mixed bag, right? We don't get a high target share from any one player. Could be one of these situations where, you know, I mention this all the time. I don't like to wish injury or ill will on anyone, but this is an offense for me that has 2 decent options. The system's really built for a good, productive running back. If one of these guys should happen to fall off the shelf and one take over as the true running back 1 and get north of, you know, 200 carries, we could be looking at a really good fantasy running back. Now, there's some depth on the roster as well, too, right? So the one thing that you have to fear with Georgia State, as we saw last year, it's just they like to rotate bodies in that offense.
Yeah, I was going to say, even if one guy, you know, happened to go down with injury, apparently they got 3 and 4 guys in that backfield that they really like. KZ Adams, incoming freshman, was a standout this spring. Marcus Carroll, their projected running back 3, I think was the spring MVP. So this is probably, you know, maybe behind App State, second best running game in the conference. I know Rasheen Ali with Marshall now. I'm not even saying, like, just in totality.
Right? Running back group, right?
Yeah, their offensive line, I think they bring back 4 starters. You know, we touched on the depth. Darren Granger is going to get involved in the running game. He averaged double-digit carries as well. So I think it's good for Georgia State as a whole that this is going to be one of the best running games in the conference. But like you said, just a ton of depth. And, take your shot late maybe on Tucker Gregg and Jameis Williams. But, unless one guy emerges, you're kind of going to be playing the, split carries in the backfields.
Yeah, I just bring that up. Together, both of them, they went over 310 carries, 1,800 yards, and 18 touchdowns as a 1-2 punch, and it was split just about 50-50, right? So Greg had more carries, but Williams had the better yards per carry average, so it just about evened out. Now, let's go over to Troy, Mike, where you and I are looking for improvement from Troy. You've got head coach John Sumrall coming in. He was the Kentucky linebackers coach. Offensive coordinator Joe Craddock comes in from UAB. Running back Kamani Vidal, I think, is really at the top of our list in regards to players that have the most fantasy appeal for this year, at least for me. How about for yourself?
Vidal for sure. I know there's some detractors of Craddock, but I think it definitely bodes well for Kamani Vidal, who just, I don't know if it was the previous regime or they like their depth, but he's never gotten that full, workload. He's always been kind of splitting. And I think he's definitely capable of taking on a heavier workload. And I think you're going to get it potentially under Craddock. Let's see. The running back one under Craddock is typically, he's got some separation from the running back two. I think 37% of the team carries typically goes to the running back one. There's UAB mixed into that data where he was just the tight ends coach and they had Dwayne McBride. But, dating back to his time at Arkansas and SMU, typically he fed his running back one. I'm also intrigued a little bit in the passing game too, because they had a late add in the offseason of Peter Costelli, a Utah transfer at quarterback. And I don't think either me or you is necessarily,
right,
sold on Gunnar Watson as a long-term solution. Right. So this is a redshirt freshman who, high 3-star recruit to a P5 program who can move a little bit. He's definitely mobile. So I'll be curious to see that kind of quarterback competition transpire over the summer.
Yeah, they brought in Ray J. Johnson as well from UAB, the receiver. And I think if there's other two areas of some fantasy appeal, keep an eye maybe on Michael Weiss, the tight end, right? And you and I also like the Troy defense special team this year, right? So don't want to kind of move on without mentioning them, Mike. And then let's go over to Southern Miss, where, Southern Miss is probably going to have a pretty decent defense themselves this year as well. They've been pretty consistent on defense, at least over the past couple of years. Last year was just a mess. They could not get a healthy quarterback. Frank Gore turned into their entire offense. He played at running back. He played quarterback. So, his numbers sort of reflected that in the end. But, they return. Gore comes back. Jason Brownlee's back at receiver. We're expecting a pretty decent year from Ty Keys at quarterback, or we think he can be in that offense, in that system, right? For me, I like Gore. I think he is really, I think they can ride him because he proved it last year that he can handle a heavy workload and really get through that. He's a player that I've really been kind of targeting in the back end of drafts if he's still available. But there are still some other pieces that we've got our eyes on the Southern Miss offense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Jason Brownlee, I mean, he posted pretty good numbers, 8 touchdowns, 80 plus targets with shit quarterback play, as you mentioned, and playing, 5 running backs at quarterback in that season finale last year. So, I mean, you would expect, just based on having a real live quarterback under center, that his numbers should improve. He had 31% of the target share last year, so he was a bona fide wide receiver one for Southern Miss. So there's some interest with him. Ty Keys, I think, is an interesting prospect maybe this year, but looking towards the future too. It was interesting. He was in a battle to start the spring, and he just, his name is popping up in every report, basically. Well, all 3 reports that you can find on Southern Miss during the spring. But his name was constantly popping up. Coaches were boosting him up as the guy right now. So, and he's a dual threat. And if you look at this system, dating back to Will Hall's time at Tulane, he had 2 top 50 quarterbacks there in Pratt and Justin McMillan.
Yep.
And McMillan had 160 carries that season. So
Yep.
we got a dual threat in Ty Keys. If he gets 160 carries, that's potentially a viable quarterback in CFF.
Yep, absolutely. Now let's go to Arkansas State, where Mike, I think for the final time, we will mention either Lane Hatcher or Logan Bonner when we mention Arkansas State, right? So Hatcher moves out. We already covered that. He went to Texas State. That leaves James Blackman as most likely the target, the trigger man for that Arkansas State offense, which last year both of those guys combined for 3,700 yards and 27 touchdowns. They threw 17 interceptions, right? Which is always that isn't good. Jaquez Cross, they added from Purdue. We know that Corey Rucker transferred out. He's now at South Carolina. And really, in the preseason, the discussion really has been Tavalence Hunt versus Jeff Foreman. Hunt more of, based off of his performance and what he did last year. And Foreman just momentum coming out of spring where he really did have, a nice spring session there. But really, that's probably the debate. It seems to be when I look at some of the results that we've gone in that we've taken part of, the drafts at least, seems like there's a little bit of a tug of war between these two guys on who favors whom, right?
Yeah, and maybe there doesn't need to be a tug of war. Just draft both. Right. Yeah. I think these two could have I think they're solidified wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, some ambiguity as to who the third guy is. We mentioned Cross. He's got some versatility. I know they brought over Champ Flemings from Oregon State, but these are solidified top 2 guys. And, depending on your preference, maybe you take one over the other. But I say with this kind of high volume passing offense, you're going to throw it 40 times a game. Why not draft both? So I like both Foreman and Hunt this year. Blackman, as long as he stays healthy, if you're throwing it 40 times a game, you could have some value. I just real quick before I move on to the running backs, I think a name that should stay on folks' radar is Jackson Daly, a true freshman for Arkansas State. We know James Blackman's injury history. We have a discorder that nicknames him James Glass Blackman. So if for some reason that he doesn't stay healthy, I think Jackson Daly's a guy that maybe you want to keep on your radar, and definitely for dynasty purposes, because he solidified the QB2 job this spring. So as a true freshman, so. That's a name to keep your eye on. And then running backs, there's really no interest here. It's always a committee approach.
Yep, I agree. Well, we're going to get a little bit of a committee, but not so much a heavy 1-2 punch over at App State. One of the best running, one of the best running games we're going to probably have not only in the conference, but in the country, where Cameron Peoples returns. He missed a little bit of time last year, still finished with 900 yards, scored 14 touchdowns. Nate Noel is back. He had 199 carries, finished with over 1,100 yards last year. Chase Bryce is back at quarterback. They lost their 3 top receivers, though. We have Christian Wells pegged at that top receiver in Appalachian State. But, my suggestion is until we see things in that passing game stabilize at App State, it's all about the running game. And I do have some thoughts on Cameron Peoples and Nate Noel, Mike. So I'll give you my thoughts first on that is, Noel's a guy that for us, we've been participating in these 12-team, 26-round best ball drafts. And I know for the last draft, I picked up Nate Noel in one of the last rounds of the draft. And I'm just a little stunned that you've got a guy with potential 1,000-yard potential that's still hanging around in the 24th, 25th round of fantasy drafts. To me, that's value because he showed what he can do last year when Peoples went down. And we're looking at one of the best running backs combinations, as you mentioned in the conference, when you were talking about, Georgia State, You've got App State, and I think you probably forgot at the time Coastal Carolina, but those three schools, those three programs, and I would argue even more so App State and Coastal Carolina, even App State could have two 1,000-yard rushers. I mean, their running game is that strong. And when you look at last year, Noel had 199 carries. Cameron Peoples had 166. I think the concern is, as we saw last year, People seems to be more of the short yards touchdown vulture in that offense. And I think that's why it's a little bit more of a stay away on Noel for some people in best ball drafts we've been in so far.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I agree on all fronts. Noel is tremendous value if you're getting him rounds 20 and beyond, which you nabbed him in. But also the fact that Peoples probably has the higher upside because he's going to get the carries in the red zone. So, I've just been kind of, I don't want to say fade, but this is not a backfield that I typically target just because, one, you're going to see a split most likely. And kind of in the same vein as Georgia State, still got Daytre Tarrington. You still got Anderson Castle, who they like, and they added a Wake Forest transfer in Monty Marshall. So, I mean, you got 5 guys that they're confident in. Now, I think there's some separation in there. Like Noel and Peoples are the clear top 2 guys, but just the carries getting spread around. It's just, again, similar vein to Georgia State, one of the best, if not the best running game in the conference. They're obviously going to be productive, but where the carries going on a consistent basis is my issue there.
Well, we know where the carries are going at Marshall. Rasheen Ali, top touchdown scorer last year in the FBS. He is back, even though the offensive coordinator has moved on. Tim Cramsey has moved on, right? And so you've got a new offensive coordinator coming in, new quarterback. Grant Wells went off to Virginia Tech. They bring in Henry Colomby from Texas Tech. Whether he's a body or whether he's productive still remains to be seen. They bring in Kalen LeBourne maybe to kind of add some depth into the backfield. Brian Robertson, the receiver from FSU as well. Corey Gamage is back. I think for you and I think we probably agree here. Rasheen Ali, Corey Gamage are probably the top 2 on our draft day radar for Marshall players. But anything you want to add in regards to maybe the coaching change and how that might affect the league, maybe regression? Will we see more of the same? What's your thoughts? We have Ali, top 5 running back this year. So we're still expecting a big year from the guy. It's a big play running back.
It is. Yeah. I'm, indecisive maybe a little bit on Ali. And I mean, he's consistently top 6-7 running back for me, but man, you kind of see reports coming out that Kalen LeBourne, a former 5-star recruit, had a pretty good spring here. Maybe they divvy up the carries a little bit. Tim Cramsey's no longer there. You got a new OC in Clint Trickett, who I read is reportedly, maybe getting Ali more touches in the passing game even, which would be interesting because 40 passes last year. 45
passes last year.
Yeah. So I mean, if that happens, then shut my ass up about him being in the top 7. He's top 2 if that happens. But Clint Trickett, didn't have the greatest season as a full-time OC at Florida Atlantic, whether that's by his fault or the now I'm forgetting the head coach there, Willie Taggart. Yeah, debatable whose fault that was when that offense kind of tanked. But I just some kind of warning signs. I know they have turnover along the offensive line, plus coordinator change, plus maybe LeBourne become something. So I'm fine with drafting Ali in the first round. I just feel confidence. I think you would agree, just more confidence in a Lou Nichols or a Bijan or a Travion over Ali.
The one thing that Ali has going against him that we never liked, like we love to see continuity. We love to see just no change at all, right? The fact that there is change just brings up a warning flag, right? But let's look at the flip side of that too. And let's talk about the reasons why we still like him. He had 250 carries for 1,400 yards and 23 touchdowns last year, Mike. even just a slight regression from those numbers still makes him a first round running back, or at least a second round at worst. He caught 45 passes last year. He had a return touchdown. Ali's one of those guys I feel like he can do more with less. And for 295 touches last year, even if he gets 250 to 275, I still feel he's going to be one of the top running backs with what he can do with the ball in his hands this year. So I'm not trying to talk anybody off the ledge whatsoever, and I don't think you're doing that either. There is some hesitation here, but there's some optimism as well because he is really good.
Yeah, I mean, change can be for the better or worse. I know it's tough to top what he did last year, but maybe some of these changes, like Trickett getting him even more touches in the passing game, could result in better numbers. Just real quick before we turn the page, I like Corey Gamage this year. He had 113 targets last year, 78 receptions, and I think I'm not a Henry Colombi fan, but I think he could do similar numbers to what Grant Wells put up last year. So you would expect a 6'4" receiver to catch more than 2 touchdowns like he did a year ago. And I got him 25th round of our 26th round best ball. So I mean, that's a guy you can get really late for how many, 78 receptions. Like, that's a guy you want to target.
Yep, absolutely. Great value, tremendous upside potential at that spot. So last program, Coastal Carolina, Grayson McCall comes back, but for the last 3 years, his top targets have been, the top targets or the top receivers in that offense, not necessarily for Grayson McCall, Javon Hiley and Isaiah Likely, the tight end wide receiver combination. Both of those guys are now gone. Our assumption is that the Georgia State transfer, Sam Pickney, maybe steps into that wide receiver 1 role. Boy, you and I would surely really love to know who and how that offense is going to incorporate the tight end this year. Are they going to do it with a player like Xavier Gravett, who, if we did have a little bit more certainty, would probably be going a lot earlier in drafts, but there's still a little uncertainty, not knowing exactly what's going to happen with those spots. And then that running back, where Braden Bennett is sort of pegged our running back 1 last year. He did a lot of damage out of the backfield. Reese White as well was a very good runner. They had 3 backs last year that could do it. Shamari Jones obviously was there between the tackles guy. A lot of conversation with you and I in the spring. A lot of who's going to be the running back 1 here. I think we both agree it's going to be whoever can do the work between the tackles. Interesting situation here, Mike, where Braden Bennett has been going off draft boards a heck of a lot, way earlier than anyone like Reese White has. And I know that I've picked up Reese White in a couple of drafts, much like Nate Noel over at Appalachian State. Late rounds, near the 20th round for Reese White. And I think that that's good value, knowing that we're still not 100% sure how the running back carries are going to shake out in this Coastal Carolina offense. Even though we project Bennett as the running back 1, there's still some potential upside for Reese White, and the value at which he's going, I find, is just too hard to pass up at around the 20th round.
Yeah, you can make the argument Reese White is potentially one of the best values in CFF right now. Just how late he's going. I think similarly to your argument with Nate Noel, right? This guy, as good as Braden Bennett could be this year, I think Reese White is definitely going to get consistent touches. They've proven that over the years at Coastal Carolina. This is just, I'm not gonna pretend to be some like football savant, right? And I know the ins and outs of schemes and shit, but I did find some stats here, and I'm gonna read them that are interesting, that kind of led to our debate with Braden Bennett. If you look at red zone carries last year, now only Shamari Jones, who wound up the leading rusher, had only 18% of the red zone carries. You know who was next? Or who led the way in red zone carries?
Tell them.
Percentage, it was Reese White.
There you go.
Reese White had more, based on, I don't think more carries in the red zone, obviously, because Shamari Jones had more, but percentage-wise, Reese White led the team in with 24% red zone, or 24% of his carries in the red zone over 15% for Braden Bennett. You know, that kind of helps the argument for Reese White. And then you kind of alluded to it with running in between the tackles. 50% of Shamari Jones's carries came in between the tackles last year. 33% for Reese White, 13% for Braden Bennett. So, you know, you look at those numbers and they kind of trend towards Reese White there. So,
Mike, you're making me want to bottle this show until we finish our final best ball drafts. And the other draft.
I mean, you see ADP change based on kind of where we rank guys and what we talk about. So I would not be surprised if that happened. But I'm just making an argument for Reese White and why you would potentially want to fade Braden Bennett, right? And we're not changing our projections right now. We really like Braden Bennett because he's going to get a healthy dose of carries. He's the guy that gets utilized in the passing game, and you would agree. I know their yards per carry are fairly similar, but Braden Bennett is extremely explosive when you watch him with the football in his hands. So I'm not trying to necessarily persuade you off of Braden Bennett, but I'm making an argument for why potentially we could see Reese White maybe be the top guy this year.
Yeah. And what about receivers? I mean, your thoughts there. You and I have had a lot of discussion about the uncertainty of tight end, but what value it could bring given that what Isaiah Likely brought to that offense last year. The question is are they going to use the tight end? Do they have somebody that they can plug and play, or was Likely just, you know, he was one of those, you know, unique specimens that was able to play the position unlike anybody else that they're going to have?
It's funny that you phrased it like that, because I was thinking the same way. Like later in drafts, I'm taking a shot on Xavier Gravett just because of what Isaiah Likely did, but maybe he's just a special case here where he was just a supreme talent at the tight end position, and Coastal didn't have a ton of options besides him and Javon Hiley. So, you know, I'll take a shot, but would it shock you in any way that they don't utilize the tight end position as much as they did in the past? And then begs the question, like, who's Grayson McCall throwing to? Like, we liked Sam Pinckney this year, but hell, that guy lost his starting job last year and had to transfer out. So it'll be interesting to see who truly emerges in this.
I said this when we were talking about Conference USA earlier when we were doing these shows. I really love Grayson McCall. I just love the way he plays. He's a tough kid, love his moxie. But for me, he's one of those players where I just don't see him being on my roster, because where I have him valued is he's just being drafted way ahead of where I have him valued. I mentioned when we did Conference USA, I thought Chris Reynolds was sort of a Grayson McCall light. And we know that Coastal Carolina is going to be one of the better teams in the conference, in Sunbelt, which is good. We know they're going to move the ball, right? But we also know that Charlotte's defense is going to be bad. So that's the reason why I like Chris Reynolds, because they're probably going to be chucking it around a lot. For me, I just don't know, man. Grayson McCall, for me, Mike, is going a little too soon. I don't think I see him on my roster. I'm not liking where I see him drafted right now. What's your take on the ADP for Grayson McCall?
It's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any strong opinions either way. I don't see necessarily the upside with Grayson McCall, and that's not a detriment really to how good of a fantasy quarterback he is. He dealt with the injury in the spring. It's kind of a no news, good news situation. I think that you didn't really read any follow-up reports like, oh, he's cautious about anything, but he dealt with an injury. How much he, wants to put wear and tear on his body in the running game with probable some NFL aspirations. So where he's going, I'm fine with it. QB2 on your roster is probably optimal for him.
Well, two consecutive years of 26 plus touchdowns. So you have to love the consistency there. The question is are we going to see more of him rushing like we did in 2020? when he went for almost 600 yards and 7 touchdowns? Or will we see a little bit more of what we saw last year, where it was more of 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, and try to keep the guy healthy a little bit? That's up for debate. We know the running back group is strong, but it was just something that I've noticed in some drafts where just the value from McCall, I think you're right. I think it's fine. But for me, I don't know. I'm just not liking at that spot where he's going in most drafts. So
I don't think we'll find out any answers, because remember 2 years ago, the team beat writer couldn't even project Grayson McCall as a starting quarterback. So I don't think we're going to get any
he
clues.
came out of nowhere. We had no clue.
Yeah.
That's it. But I may bottle up this show. 3 best ball drafts down, 3 Reese White shares. So I've got one more to go. See how late I can scoop them up this time. But Mike, that's going to do it. Second to last show is in the books. We've got one more left to go. The SEC, all of you guys watching this, happy holidays to you. Enjoy the 4th weekend. Everybody be safe. Enjoy. Go out and come into the website, get your preseason fantasy draft guide. We've got over 85 pages of just pure college fantasy football content, from rankings to the depth charts Mike did, conference write-ups, impact freshmen, returning offensive linemen, printable draft day cheat sheets. Everything's moving. We've got you covered all the way in the preseason and through the season, in-season rankings, projections. Mike's got the DFS write-up. We've got you all covered this year, as we always do at the CFF site for college fantasy football. But that's going to do it for the show here, Kyle, for the preseason preview series, Sun Belt Conference. For my partner, Mike Bainbridge, my name's Joe DeSalvo with the CFF site. We'll see you when we're talking SEC after the holiday weekend. Till then.